work session, which is review of proposed debt management policy. And I remembered, let's do introductions first, and we'll start at this end. Intro.
Oh,
For the record.
Forrest Dunbar.
Weddleton.
Patrick Flynn.
Ian Flynn.
L.B. Gray Jackson.
Bill Evans.
And in the audience, can the two gentlemen in the audience please join us at this table, please? And then state your name for the record.
Yeah, I'm Ross Griswold, Public Finance and Investment Division Manager.
I'm Steve Cantor, First Southwest.
Right, please join us. Okay, I think, Ross, you're going to do the presentation, so you got the floor.
And let me, Madam Chair, if I might, just to kind of like set the stage for Ross's discussion. The reason we're presenting a debt management policy is because in the past we only had sort of an informal handshake, if you will, debt management policy. Given that we have approximately $2 billion of debt with the municipality, and given that the rating agencies have said having a written debt management policy is a good idea, we went ahead and wrote down developed a debt management policy that we think sort of encapsulates what we do in terms of how we manage debt here at the municipality, and it as well sort of provides for those scenarios that might happen in the future, namely the city grows, the city stays the same, or the city starts to decline in terms of population and so forth. So this is an attempt really to kind of capture all the possible typical scenarios and give us some guidance down the road. Of course, one of the questions that's always faced by both the administration and the assembly is how much debt are we going to put on the next ballot proposition? So we can decide if we're going to put much out there for the voters at the end of the day to decide how much they want to approve. But that's in this debt management policy, and with that, I'll turn it over to Ross and let him walk through what we've written down.
Thank you, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Ms. Jackson. And you all have the PowerPoint presentation open. Hopefully it was you received it in advance, along with the Assembly resolution and the Assembly memorandum that will be on the consent agenda at the meeting on Tuesday. And also with us, as you may have heard earlier, is Steve Cantor. He's our financial advisor for the city of the municipality of Anchorage. He's been our financial advisor since 2005.
One quick question, if I may. So is somebody going to run the PowerPoint presentation?
All I brought was the.
I'm sorry. I thought that it was being set up for you. That's
No.
that's fine. We don't need. Thank
That's
you.
okay. We'll
Please
just use this.
continue. Yeah.
Okay, Madam Chair and Assembly members, on the PowerPoint presentation, if you want to go to page 2, that is the agenda that we hope to go through today. Page 3 is the current debt management policy. The current debt management policy of the municipality is unwritten, it's informal, however it has been in place for many years. The policy applies to both general purpose bonds for general government as well as school bonds or schools bonds for the Anchorage School District. These bonds together are general obligation bonds of the municipality supported by what's called ad valorem taxes that we tax to pay the debt service on. There are general obligation bonds and they're looked at as one credit. Credit is another name for the municipality of Anchorage as far as rating agencies are concerned. We're a credit, we issue debt, so we seek the capital markets for credit. Bonds are rated AAA by Standard & Poor's and AA+ by Fitch Ratings. The policy is the first bullet at the very top, where in the past we have for the most part said that we are going to go to the voters and ask them to authorize general obligation debt on our bond ballot propositions in an amount equal to or less than what we are retiring in principal during that current fiscal year. So we want to, that's what our current policy is. So let's go to page 3. So the reason we're here today is we'd like to update our debt management policy. And why do we do that? Well, the municipality has approximately $2 billion in debt outstanding. It's a giant portfolio of debt, of which approximately $700 or $800 million is general obligation debt. It's very prudent. It's a prudent financial courtesy and a best practice quite frequently in the past couple of years have commented, they feel it's important for us to formalize our debt policy and put it in writing. They feel it's very important to us. There's a couple comments on the page there talking about our interactions with them and discussion about debt over the past couple of years. Higher credit ratings means a lower cost of funds and lower taxes for taxpayers. So that is why we're talking about the debt management policy. The chart on the left-hand side of the page in the darker blue shows our credit ratings over time. If you go back to 2005, we were rated AA- by 2 rating agencies, and over time here you can see how at the very top there now we're AAA Standard & Poor's, AA+ by Fitch. On the right-hand side of the page in the light blue, this is a response to the question that we are frequently asked. Robert and I are frequently asked, what does it cost if we're downgraded? So we've quantified this in this chart, and using an S&P rating and a couple of assumptions, if we were AAA rated by S&P, or if we were AA rated by S&P, and we use the current interest rate environment as of June last month of this year, and we also use the assumption that we issued the same amount of debt that we issued in November of 2015. And using those three assumptions, what if we were AAA rated and we were downgraded to AA? In the middle column, your average annual debt service per year would go up by $190,000, approximately 2.1%. Your increase over the life of that 20-year bond issue would increase $3.8 million with a present value of $2.9 million. Now, in the middle of that box, I have going from AA to single A, but more importantly, if you went from AAA, which is where we are now, down to two levels down to single A, your debt service would increase $283,000 per year, an increase of 3.25%, or $5.6 million over the life of the bonds, which is 20 years for general obligation bonds. Now,
Mr. Weddleton?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, jump in. What scenario would bump us from AAA to A? I mean, doing this change, if we don't do this change, we won't drop down to an A. So it's
Well-
like the economy tanks.
Well, we're going to talk more about what triggers a change and things like that as we go on here. The question is always asked, what happens if we get downgraded? So I've taken it that if we got downgraded, we would more than likely go to AA. We wouldn't just probably drop to single. That's a dramatic change. But then I'm always asked, well, what happens if we drop 2 levels? So I put that on the chart here. And the importance of this chart is just showing that there is an impact. There's a dollar impact that can be quantified for dropping your rating. And imagine now, we go to the markets every year, almost every year, for approximately the same amount. And I used last year's dollar amount in this assumption and the current interest rate environment from last month, June. Imagine doing this every year and you're downgraded. Now, 10 years later, if we went from AAA to AA, 10 years later, you can take the $190,000 and the $3.8 million and multiply it by 10. So now you've foregone $38 million over the life of those 10 bond issues over 10 years, which would take 30 years to amortize away, because it took 10 years to issue 20-year bonds. We normally issue 20-year bonds. So there is a quantifiable number here that you can associate with a downgrade.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. But typically, we would be going down more incrementally, like from AAA to AA plus, and then AA to AA minus, and down like that. It's typically we don't go from AAA straight to AA. It would generally go down incrementally. Is that correct?
Ms. Jackson and Mr. Peterson, you are correct. There are incremental steps here. It goes AAA, AA plus, AA minus, A plus, A. So It was a little more straightforward, I thought, for presentation purposes, to do it this way, but somewhere in between, it's not exactly in between. You could interpolate these numbers. But for purposes of this conversation, I felt this was an appropriate way to show it. Thank you. I'd like to go to page 5 unless there's any. So on page 5, basically it's a very simple page showing general purpose obligation bonds, general obligation bonds that we have authorized by the voters but not yet issued, of $95 million. For school bonds, we have $48 million of authorized but not yet issued. We issue the debt when we need it. These numbers are in line with where we've been for the last 5 to 8 years. We've always had, I'd say, $80 to $120 million available for each of these two line items, except now this year is $48 million for schools. As we know, the schools went 0 for 1 with the voters last year, and they were asking for approximately $47 million. Page 6. Page 6 is our proposed policy. The municipality shall manage its debt according to prudent standards. I've identified what I defined as seven different prudent standards. And this is contrary to our current unwritten policy where it's just a flat dollar amount. What are we paying off this year? We're not going to issue more than that. We've looked at I've worked with Steve here and his staff, and I've contacted rating agencies directly. I've reviewed their framework for which they use to rate entities and their criteria within the categories in their framework. And the first 4 here are the critical ones they look at when they look at your debt. Their framework is their overall look at your at an issuer. Within the framework are categories like debt, investments, management, the economy, things like that. We're looking at just the debt category here. And the first 4 bullets there are the key ones they look at when they rate you as a credit. Then there's other items such as extraordinary circumstances, including natural disasters, also known as earthquakes up here. And then the last one is rating agency criteria as it changes from time to time. And as such criteria applies to us as a credit within which the category we are rating, such as AAA right now with Standard & Poor's. The second bullet from the bottom is taking the existing debt policy and expanding it a little bit, bringing it up to date, and saying, well, we don't have just general obligation debt, we have other appropriation-backed debt, such as master lease debt that we appropriate money for each year. That should be considered as overall debt. That's our bona fide debt of the municipality. And I've taken that and defined it sort of as a maximum annual debt amount, and I've applied the formula used in the tax cap. What's the growth in the population over the last 5 years? What is the CPI over the last 5 years? Take the average of that, add them together, and multiply it out. It's the same format as a tax cap. It's in the 2 documents that you have, the memorandum and the resolution. And I said, well, here's another category we can use as a prudent standard to manage our debt with. Maybe 1.5 times that, maybe set that as a benchmark. We won't exceed 1.5 times the maximum annual debt calculated using that formula. What we've done here is we've created 7 different standards that gives us the flexibility to manage our debt within various amounts of flexibility, various categories of flexibility, and still stay focused on how we fit within the rating agency's criteria.
Mr. Flynn?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Ross, a couple of questions. First off, the 4th bullet, you speak of rapid annual debt principal amortization. If I recall correctly, most of the bonds we issue are 20-year term. And if I recall my amortization tables, you really don't start getting after the principal until about the 8th or 9th year. Is this consistent with our current payment patterns?
It's good, Madam Chair, Mr. Flynn, it's a good observation. You're correct. Just like mortgage loan, you're paying all the interest up in the six years, you're paying mostly interest.
Yeah.
The years 6 through 10, you're paying mostly principal. But remember, you're issuing debt every year, and so you have another category of 20 years, and you put that, and you line them all up on top of each other, you get a downward sloping curve. And so actually, after you've done that for 20 years, which we have, most of your principal now is amortizing in the first 10 years, as opposed to if you just had one loan.
Okay, so, all right. So if I took out a $10,000 note on my house every year for 20 years,
Right.
I'm paying
After 10
roughly
years,
half principal.
most of the
every time.
principal will be amortizing out in the first half of what your remaining cycle is. And I looked at that to make sure that we fit in there. And the rating agency, the criteria is, they like to see 65% of it amortizing in the next 10 years. And it's actually a category, and we fit well within that.
Okay, thank you, that helps.
Thank you.
And I have one more on that question.
Certainly.
I just want to make sure I'm clear on the 6th bullet here. So our maximum annual debt is the 97 million that you referred to later in the presentation.
Correct.
Sorry, I read ahead yesterday. And so what I think I'm hearing you say, that's municipal debt and school district debt. And what I think I hear you say is that we can go 50% beyond that for things like the convention center, AWU, ML&P, et cetera. Is that what we're talking about here for that?
Madam Chair and Mr. Flynn, we are looking at just general obligation debt here. The convention center is a separate entity, and the water utility and the wastewater utility and ML&P, they're separate credits, actually. They're a credit. They're their own issuing credit, and they're separate. We're talking about general obligation debt.
So what falls into this category?
Let's skip ahead to page 10 for a moment.
Okay.
And Mr. Flynn has identified correctly, if I looked at just the general obligation debt that was maturing, and look at this, the second line bullet, the hyphen bullet there, and we'd see $92 million maturing in 2017, plus $3.3 million of appropriation back debt, also known as master lease debt, for a total of $95 million. Now, that's sort of the old formula back on page 3. But now I've taken, let's put an annual adjustment factor in there for inflation and population growth, just like the tax cap. And we take 100%, which is your dollar amount, and we take 2.12%, that's the average 5 years CPI. And you take 0.48%, that's the average growth in acreage over the past 5 years, the last 2 years of which has been a decrease, a very slight decrease in population. So you add those together, you get 102%. You multiply that times the 95, and you're up at 97 on the top line there. So that's sort of your inflation-proof number that fits in category in bullet number 6, back on page 6 of our prudent standards. Now, if you multiply that times 1.5, that gives you the flexibility to accommodate extraordinary circumstances, such as a natural disaster, a giant intersection that needs to be repaired, perhaps from an earthquake, a school that is a big bullet number if a new school needed to be built or torn down and rebuilt. Those are the things that fall into that 6th category.
Okay. I know this is going to sound naive, but would it make more sense to, rather than refer to an occasional 1.5 times the maximum annual debt issuance because of a specific project, to look at that within the context of 5 years or 7 years and say, over this time period, we're going to maintain at or below our average maximum annual debt over that time.
Madam Chair and Mr. Flynn, if I may, let's skip to page 13, because our answer should be there.
Oh, all right. I guess I didn't read it ahead.
We read it to your question. On page 13, every policy, there's exceptions to it. There's another page here for exceptions that we talk about. But if you vary from your policy, what happens? We are frequently asked, what happens if we vary from our policy? Are we going to be automatically downgraded? Well, generally speaking, a policy like this that you have a variance on, it doesn't automatically trigger a downgrade. Now, if we have a policy of making our debt service on time, if we varied from that, that would trigger a downgrade. We're talking about something not quite as sensitive as that. If you do vary from the policy, you do need to have an explanation about why you varied from it, and perhaps how you are going to come back in line with your policy. And here's some justifiable and defendable reasons on page 13 to vary from that policy. And as Mr. Flynn suggested, maybe we meet that policy over 3, 4, or 5 year period of time. That's one justifiable and very defendable way to say we still are in line with our policy. There's other things like a road project, maybe Tudor and Old Seward is devastated in an earthquake. Maybe we want to build another overpass. And in case in a few years down the road, Anchorage starts to do some material growth. As I mentioned, we've had some immaterial decrease in population the last 2 years. But maybe in a few years we'll have some material growth, which will trigger the need for expanding our infrastructure here in Anchorage. We are a very young city comparatively to other cities in the lower 48. Very young city. An example is we just expanded, I think it's Elmore, where we've kind of gone through and made it connect, and there's some other things where 2 roads weren't at one point meeting, now they are. That's just not rehabilitation of our roads, that's expanding our infrastructure of our road system.
Did you have anything else, Mr. Flynn?
That was all, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Flynn. Mr. Evans?
Yeah, and this just follows up on that same conversation. It makes sense to me that, you want to be able to have variances to the policy, things you don't predict come up, or things that you have opportunities to do. So that makes sense, and I'm comfortable with that. I'm a little concerned, though, that because you have the ability to make a variance without necessarily incurring a downgrade, that you would establish the policy to be 1.5%. Because that sort of like is it seems to be building in a variance almost, where your formula is already including natural growth. It seems like you would have either one or the other. My concern being that if we establish the policy at 1.5%, it doesn't necessarily limit it to extraordinary circumstances, and we would be in a different assembly at some point might just start using that 1.5 as the ceiling.
Well, I read this as a soft ceiling and a hard ceiling. The soft ceiling being the formulaic referred to on page 10. In this case, $97 million for next year, and the hard ceiling would be 150% of that, so $145 million would be a hard ceiling. Is that correct?
Mr. Evans, Mr. Harris had a comment relative to your comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Evans, and perhaps I'll try to grab this for Mr. Flynn as well. So, again, as I said at the start, we're really trying to create a policy that hopefully we want to come back for a couple, 3 years and say, we need some changes. So we tried to build it for the case where the city grows, where the city stays the same, and the city complies with everything. At the end of the day, it's the administration and the assembly have to have a conversation about how many bond propositions we're going to put before the voters. That's really kind of what this is talking about. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it's the voters that say, yeah, we want to sign off on more debt. So this is simply a way for us to sort of write out a policy that we thought was that would be good for all time zones, really, if you will, and allow us to be within our policies and yet still sort of take account for whether the city starts to grow rapidly in the future or starts to decline. We still have a policy that meets those contingencies. And at the end of the day, whether or not the assembly approves putting a bond proposition on the ballot is, as you well know, subject to numerous discussions about the merits of individual projects and so forth. And so even if you say we can go up to 1.5 times, that doesn't mean that's going to happen. And certainly the voters have to say it.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Mr. Evans?
And I appreciate that, and I think it makes sense, and I'm all supportive of having a formalized debt policy like you're putting together. That makes perfect sense to me. But I am concerned that the 1.5%, we may never go to that, but I think once you establish in policy that number, people look at it, especially people who aren't in the room when you made the policy, and that becomes the ceiling. And you can have soft ceilings in between, but those don't really matter, because we're looking at, okay, this is within our policy, we're putting it out there, and it almost then becomes a goal at some level, 10 years down the road. So I'm just throwing out the fact that, since variances are possible for unpredicted reasons and for opportunities, having a much narrower bar, and in fact, I would advocate just whatever the maximum debt is after being calculated with the growth and inflation, I'd be more comfortable.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chairman, so one of the things is, as we sort of said when putting this together, trying to look back over the last 5 years, last 6 years, and say, what have we done in the past? Well, a few months ago, we retired $36 million. We went to the voters with 47.8, and they approved 47.8. So we wanted to have a policy that wouldn't right off the bat, we'd have to go to the rating agency and say, well, we've got this policy, we retired $1 of debt, and we're going to issue no more than $1 of debt, except for this year. So we wanted to have a policy that was just clear enough that over this last 4, 5, 6 years, that we sort of examined those contingencies and made sure that we have a policy which is both workable and at the end of the day, as we go have conversations with rating agencies that they understand. We do have a policy and we are meeting it.
And just if I may, and I understand, in fact, this year when we passed that, one of the main questions we asked was, because that was a clear departure from what we had been doing, we asked the administration about that. Is that signaling a new policy or whatever? And the answer was that no, it was an exception. That they meant to maintain the previous informal policy of only putting out as much debt as we were retiring. So I mean that, and that's what I like that policy. But I do appreciate that the actually addition of adding the cost of living and the growth, because we didn't have that previously, and I think that's an improvement. But I do prefer to aim closer to that, and I'd like the policy to aim as close to that as possible. I think I've made myself clear.
Mr. Griswold?
Madam Chair and Mr. Evans, thank you both. And that's a good observation, Mr. Evans. If I may, the 1.5 is in there, as Robert noted. However, in addition to that, I would like to add that your point is well taken about, some other assembly comes in as 1.5 times. Now, these 7 standards aren't meant to necessarily be separate and independent of each other. Because once you start issuing 1.5 times, year after year after year, then your criteria in the top 4 here start to get skewed and fall out of the category. And then Mr. Cantor comes to me and says, Ross, you and the assembly have got to watch this now, because now you're out of the criteria on a bunch of categories, and the rating agencies are going to take exception to it. So it's you see, you use these 7 sort of in conjunction, perhaps in tandem with each other, and as long as you're not putting all of them in chaos, then a one-time variance doesn't generally do that.
Okay, no, Mr. Wilson?
Fine. I'm worried that 1.5 come in as opposed to 1.25 or something like that. I mean, it looks like from these numbers, 1.25 would be about right.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Littleton. So, 1.5 was a number that when we looked at, what we thought might happen in the future, that was a number we figured that would cover all of our contingencies and cover what we did in 2000. This year, for example, 2016. We were just trying to find something that we thought, wouldn't end up with us having to have a conversation with the rating agency saying, hey, we've got this debt management policy that we should program. So really that was kind of about it. I mean,
If I may, Madam Chair and Mr. Whittleton, if you look on page 11, the reason I have this page in there, and to follow up with Robert's idea here, if you look on the left-hand side of the page, that's general purpose debt. Look back over the last 5 years, the debt we've retired, the amount we requested from the voters, and the amount the voters authorized. Each of those 5 years, with the exception of 16, we asked the voters for less. And we got it we got most of what we asked for. But in 2016, we asked for $11 million more than the 36, almost a 30% increase. So right there, you're approaching that 1.5.
I see it as approaching the 1.25.
We went past that when we went to the third, 1.3. But then if you look on the right-hand side of the chart, that's the school district. See, retired debt versus voter requested and voter authorized. And only one time in the last 5 years did they ask for more than they retired, and that was back in 2012. And they actually asked for $4 million more, and they received it from the voters. So that's a piece of history. You know, the future doesn't always reflect what's happened in the past, but it's an important thing to see a trend there. And if you turn to the next page, you'll see page 12. You'll see what the upcoming amounts are. The columns on the right-hand side of the page, the two columns. The far right is for the school district. That's the retired debt amount in the next 3 years. The second from the right is the general obligation debt, along with what I call ABO, asset appropriation-backed obligations, combined with the GO debt for general government. So there's material amounts coming our way, and like I said, if you go to page 13, if you vary from the policy from those amounts or from some of the criteria in the first 4 categories on the 7 standards on page 6, if you have a variance from the policy, like I said, this kind of variance doesn't always necessarily result in a downgrade. You need to have an explanation of what you're going to do to come back in line with your policy, and there's some ways to do it, some justifiable and defendable reasons for doing it, and you have a reason or a plan and how you're coming back. It's better to have a policy and occasionally miss it than to not have a policy at all. And that is right from the rating agencies. You're better to have a policy and occasionally miss it, and then come back and put a plan in place on how you're going to come back. Because with every prudent standard or with every policy, there's going to be sometime you're going to miss it out of no control of your own. Think back to the Great Recession in 2007 and 8. Every state and local government, they were blowing through all of their policies. But they went to the rating agency and said, now we need a lesser debt here. Here's the plan to come back in line with their policies over the next couple of years. And in that case, it was probably over the next 5 or 10 years because of the higher degree of which their chaos brought them to because of the Great Recession. We covered a lot of things here. So
One moment, please, Mr. Weddington.
So would there be a negative impact from rating agencies if instead of 1.5 we said 1?
Pardon?
Is there a negative impact basically of our current policy plus the increase for, and then similar to the property tax increase? I mean, would are rating agencies more comfortable with 1.5 or would 1 make them even more comfortable?
Steve, what do you think?
Through the chair, Mr. Weddleton, the rating agencies are not going to tell you what they want. They're going to respond to what the municipality and simply the wisdom passes. But they want to have flexibility so that you have the ability to manage. And as Mr. Harris mentioned, ultimately, voters decide whether this is an appropriate amount of debt to assume through the electoral process. So I'm not sure that the number is that critical, other than it is a number, as also alluded to, we have a policy. The policy is consistent with past practices. It allows for the 3 economic scenarios that Robert described: a slow, no growth, decline, and also an increase. So that's why we recommended that you adopt the 1.5, even though it is a somewhat conservative number that we don't ever think we're going to get there.
I think what the point is, we know we'll occasionally have exceptions. We don't want to have too many.
But
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Steele.
Thank you. How does the state's actions impact us? State's having a tough time militarily, real tough. What does that do?
well, the rating agencies are going to examine what's happening with the state, as you know, the state has been downgraded by all three rating agencies. And all three rating agencies have also indicated that without further action, the rating is going to fall further. Fortunately, the municipality is somewhat insulated in part from the, because you have your own economic base, you're not really dependent on that much money from the state. However, if the state does go into substantial economic decline, that will inevitably affect the municipalities.
Look at the year.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, I have two questions. One for you, actually, Madam Chair. I see on there timeline on page 14, they met with the Budget Advisory Commission before they met with us. Now, I was wondering if we would hear from the BAC before we went forward with this, or are we going to hear sort of what the BAC thinks about this or something?
What page is it on that this says?
Page 14.
14 and 15.
Okay, so let me follow up. Give me a moment. So you met with the Budget Advisory Commission, Paul?
Madam Chair, Mr. Dunbar, yes, we just did, and presented to them, walked them through essentially the same, gave them the same presentation we gave you, and they voted to recommend approval of the policy.
Really?
Yes.
Good for you.
And can I follow up, please? Because I have the opportunity. And I think Lance already knows this, but I would really like to see anything dealing with finances presented to the Assembly first, before the Budget Advisory Commission. Because they're advisory to the mayor and assembly. And I'm just bringing it out. I could have said it in private, but I didn't want to. But we need to have things, especially when it comes to our finances, presented to us first, and then the Budget Advisory Commission. But just a note for the future, and I appreciate your understanding. Thank you. Anything else, Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, so a more direct question for you guys. And I apologize if it's in these materials, I just didn't catch it. I was reading through, but how is this similar or different from these kind of policies in other similar sized cities? Did you draw from another city to develop this? If somebody asked me, what city did you get this from? I guess San Antonio.
I think we didn't pick one particular city. We tried to choose cities that were similar to the municipality, both in size, in complexity, and also in terms of rating. The rating agencies do have their own criteria in terms of what a AAA rated municipality should go for versus a AA and single A. So we took the AAA, we compared it to other AAA rated municipalities, and we also dominated that to municipalities' specific circumstances.
So some of the specific criteria here are ones used by other cities?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Please continue, Mr. Rockwell. Ms. Rowland.
Sure, thank you, Madam Chair. Let's see, there was, I think.
We're on slide 7 before we start being, we're on 6 and now we should be on 7, I think.
Let's go to page 8.
I have a question on 7 before we move on.
Mr. Flynn?
I was just curious, the approved capital budgets for general government and school districts that require less than 5% of its current fiscal year capital budget to be funded from current year revenues. If I read that correctly, we're saying that we are going to appropriate general fund dollars in the amount of, at 5% or more of our capital budgets in order to maintain the policy? Is that?
Madam Chair, Mr. Flynn.
Just an
Let's
exception.
go to page 8, we can answer that question.
Okay.
I probably should have these 2 pages switched around actually, but as part of the policy, we are suggesting that the municipality shall not approve capital budgets for its general government and school district that requires less than 5% of the respective current fiscal year capital budgets to be funded from current year revenues of the general government and school district. So what we're saying is, you've got a capital budget and you've got current year revenues. Rather than finance all of your capital budget with debt, we're requiring that you finance at least 5% of it, respectively, with current year revenues.
Okay.
And so I went back and looked at the last 5 years and saw that for general government, we were, on the average, we financed our CIP program by 14% of it was financed with current year revenues. So I felt that 5%, which was also used by other communities, was a very palatable number compared to the 14 that we have used that we've experienced the last 5 years. So that is one of the things that we added. The other thing is, talks about interest rate swaps. We don't do that. The CFO has a bunch of responsibilities. We can handle that. That's not an issue, but I'm telling you what was part of the policy. But then going back to page 7, I also, I call it prudent standards, which is the 7 items on the prior page. There's a couple of what we call prudent exceptions. And one of them is, what if we do not fund our CIP with 5% of our CIP with current year revenues? I'm calling that a prudent exception. Maybe we wouldn't do that.
But, and I just want to drill down on that specific topic, if I might, Madam Chair. Good. I mean, what counts as, I know current year revenues, if we take, $10 million out of the property taxes that we collect and say we're going to use that to pay for road X, obviously that's current year revenues. Are state grants current year revenues? Are federal grants current year revenues? What falls into that category?
In the Assembly resolution and the Assembly memorandum, or the special resolution, I define what current year revenues are. And
I read that.
And we do subtract. It gets down to a very small number. It gets down to a very small number when you take some of those things out.
Mr. Flynn, I really appreciate that question because I have a question without looking at the resolution. And so when you're talking about current year revenues, what revenues are we talking about? Because we're talking about a capital budget. You're not talking about operating, are you? I hope not.
I don't see the definition, maybe.
Madam Chair and Mr. Flynn, on page 2 of 4 of the resolution,
Sort of it.
we define governmental funds revenue. And it's defined there on the bottom of page 2 of the.
So if I can follow up, so you're talking about operating revenues, both of them, right?
Yes.
I mean, so how are you gonna fund capital budget for operating revenues?
Well,
Ross, I think what the chair and I are trying to get to here is what we put into the CAFR as revenue. I recognize you're pulling out the on behalf payments. That's reasonable. It's a pass through. But for in my intuitive mind, I wouldn't consider state grants, for example, to be part of our current year revenues. I guess governmental funds revenue is what the definition is here. And yet I have a hard time contemplating how in the world we get to 14% of our budget being current funds if we're talking about only taxes that we collect as a municipality. So I'm thinking there's stuff in there that I wouldn't think of intuitively, and that's okay if that's the case. I just want to know what we're voting on.
And I'll follow up with Mr. Flynn's comment, and my concern is using any operating money for capital funding. And we can talk more offline.
and
Like so,
and
we
I
don't
have
have
a chart
that
here
much
that I
time
came
left.
up with the 14 on it, and the 14 came from the chart in the CAFR and in the capital budget of, it has a CIP program on it, and then it has the sources of funds on it. And debt, there's general obligation debt, there's federal funds, state funds, another category, and then there's other. And within that other, we had to drill down to see what was just operating, or just what was revenue versus grants or something like that we found in there. And so in that other category, which it looks like it's 26%, if you do the average over the last 5 years, it really turned out to be 14% of current year revenues.
You're telling me I got to dig into my CAFR over the weekend. Okay. But it would be
Thank you.
helpful to break that out.
We'll talk more offline.
We can bring something that details it.
Yeah, thank you. Were you, no other questions you want to continue? Thank you.
I think we have pretty much touched on the basically the 7 prudent standards. We talked about a couple of exceptions. We talked about variance from the policy. We talked about, on page 8, we talked about other things that are in the policy here from a big picture viewpoint. Page 9 was basically some defined terms that are used in the resolution to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. Pretty much gone through the presentation here, page by page, not necessarily in the same order. On page 14, we have the schedule as we have it. On today's July 8th, on Tuesday, this comes to the Assembly as a resolution on the consent agenda. We certainly can distribute some additional things in the meantime, addressing the most recent question here. What we are planning on doing is, as you know, the Standard & Poor's rating agency has a negative outlook on our AAA rating. And they assigned us that negative outlook from a stable outlook back in November of last year when we did our general obligation bond issue. They are required to revisit that negative outlook within 12 months, and their timing is that they would do it in November, if not before. So the mayor and Robert and I are planning to visit both rating agencies in 2 weeks to visit with them about, and in particular, Standard & Poor's, the negative outlook. We're going to present with them the state of our economy here, the state of Anchorage, as well as some very good-looking financial statements from 2015 showing a nice surplus of fund balance. We want to show them, hopefully, a formalized debt management policy. We're going to discuss with them a broader base of taxes. We've just implemented a 5% marijuana and marijuana product tax. We've talked in tandem here about strengthening our fund balance policy. We're giving that some thought staff-wise, and we will talk with the Assembly about that in the near future. So there's a lot of things that are good about Anchorage that we want to bring to the rating agencies, and in particular Standard & Poor's, because we want them to remove the negative outlook from our AAA rating. And that's a trip that we feel we will be able to hopefully do that on.
Sneak peek, what are you thinking about fund balance?
Well, the fund, if I may, Madam Chair and Mr. Flynn, fund balance is something we're talking about a little bit about strengthening. And I think I'll let Robert talk about that and elaborate that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, these policies, a debt management policy, a fund balance policy, they, one of the things we do is we have conversations with rating agencies is ask, where are the criteria at? The criteria for the fund balance has recently changed, and we're taking a look at that from the rating agency side, taking that information and deciding what we want to do. We passed a fund balance policy here, I think about a year, maybe a little over a year ago. And this might be one of those things where from time to time you come back and revisit it to sort of ask the general set of questions about whether or not it's still, if we're trying to maintain a AAA rating, what does that do to our fund balance policy? If we want to look at something different, what does that mean for our fund balance policy? So those are a series of discussions that are going on right now, and when it might change and what it might change to would be things that once we get that resolved, we'll bring back to consent discussions.
Okay, well, timeline, we passed at least an intent to refund some of our surplus to voters. We probably better know what fund balance policy is going to be before we do that.
Madam Chair, Steve, do you have any closing comments here about either the debt management policy?
Madam Chair, no, first of all, we appreciate the interest that the Assembly has shown in this important item, not only for this county, but also for the rating agencies. I think your questions are well placed, and we will certainly respond to those if we do not have the data. But it is important for the rating agencies to know that this is a topic that's been discussed by the senior level management of the municipality, and that, this is something you're taking very seriously.
Thank you. Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to make sure, you had asked a question earlier, clarifying about the 5% that we spend out of current year revenues that go towards, for example, capital expenditures. So to your point, if something's marked as an operating expense, I don't believe we pay for that for capital expense.
Right.
The money all filters into a pot of money at the beginning of the year, and then as we budget it out, some will go to, the majority of it will go to operating type expenses that you expect would be expensed during the current year. And it's that, I think 14% is sort of gets shuffled for things that we would in the accounting world consider to have a long life. And so those are things that we consider a capital asset. Lance is here, and if I sort of describe that improperly, I'll ask him to sort of step in. But
We've capitalized some of the labor for SAP, for example.
exactly, yeah. So that's where that number comes from. But it's certainly not a reallocation of money from an operating budget to a capital budget without going to the assembly and say, we think we had this money earmarked over here as part of the approved budget, and we need to move it over there. So that those things don't happen without the assembly's approval.
Right, and I didn't think that,
Yeah.
but I know that, our operating money, at the end of the year, it lapses into fund balance. Our capital money doesn't.
Mhm.
Okay, and so that's kind of what I was talking about in terms of the 5%. So do you go to a capital budget to grab that 5%?
No, that's Lance.
No, but I think as you mentioned earlier, we should, in the capital budget, in the CIP, there's basically 4 columns as you mentioned. There's basically the bond, the federal, and the state. The 5% takes the federal and the state, as Ross alluded to. We have another column. The other includes funds from 101, the service areas, and the others. It also
Contributions.
includes the amount that we pay to debt and for other things,
Right.
and a couple others. It's those first 3. For some places, we do take some operating money and move them into capital, but we do that through an appropriation process through the assembly. One example is we do it in operation and maintenance. So if they have some operating dollars they want to move to a capital expense, we do that through an appropriation process, and we do it every year.
Right, and I see what you're saying when you mentioned the 4 columns, because the other is, contributions from operating for matches or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay, I get it now. Thank you. Okay, I'm clear.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Still looks that broken out, that's it.
No other questions?
This may show my ignorance, but the voters turned down school bonds. Well, we still have to pay off a portion of school bonds that come in. And we included in the formula typically the new bond money, but we're not going to have that. So when we pay off that portion of the school bonds that is due, does that money come out of that balance things out? I'm just thinking in terms of we're adding 50% of operating money in there. So we've got to pay off something like $40 million, $40-some million worth of school bonds without getting any. We're not buying any more bonds, so maybe that sort of balance out. The debt would go down a lot faster and a lot more than it would otherwise. And everybody's happy with that, the formula works.
So far.
You know that?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Steele. No other questions? Next session's adjourned.